we are essentially treating international communications by U.S. persons as waiving any privacy interest in those communications.
I'm Stephanie Pell, Senior Editor at Lawfare, and this is the Lawfare Podcast, March 22nd, 2023. On December 31st of this year, Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act will expire unless it is reauthorized by Congress. Section 702 authorizes the U.S. government, in order to obtain foreign intelligence information, to target foreigners who are reasonably believed to be outside of the U.S. and collect their communications inside the U.S. without a warrant, even when such surveillance may involve the incidental collection of communications of U.S. persons. Privacy and civil liberties advocates have long raised concerns about the government's ability to conduct so-called backdoor searches of U.S. person information acquired incidentally through the collection of the communications of foreigners. U.S. government officials have argued that it is imperative for Congress to reauthorize Section 702. To talk about Section 702 and its reauthorization, I sat down with Travis LeBlanc, a member of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board and a partner at Cooley LLP. We discussed his concerns with the way the government may search or use U.S. person information incidentally collected under Section 702, the aspects of the government's position on reauthorization on which he may agree, and how he believes Congress should reform Section 702. It's the Lawfare Podcast, March 22nd. Travis LeBlanc and FISA Section 702. Travis, you are a member of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, often called the P-Club for short. Before we dig into FISA Section 702, can you tell us about the P-Club's mandate? What is its focus? What has Congress authorized it to do?
Well, before getting into the substance of the P-Club, like a good government employee, I should note that I'm here in my individual capacity. The views expressed here are my own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the board or any of its board members. As you noted, I am one of the presidentially appointed Senate-confirmed members of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. It is a 5-member, bipartisan, independent agency within the executive branch that is tasked with overseeing the executive branch to ensure that its activities to protect the nation against terrorism also balance privacy and civil liberties concerns. Because currently President Biden is a Democrat, 3 of the members of the board are Democrats and 2 are Republicans, with the chair being a full-time employee and the remainder of the board members serving in a part-time capacity. We have 2 general functions that we do day to day, one of which is to provide advice and the other is oversight. In our advice capacity, which is typically confidential, we are called upon by the 17 components of the intelligence community to assist them with providing counseling around privacy and civil liberties concerns of national security programs and activities. In an oversight capacity, we're in more of an independent capacity there, which is often public and often garners a lot more attention, where we are looking at programs and activities that we independently determined to look into to assess the extent to which the privacy and civil liberties concerns are adequately protected in the nation's efforts to protect against terrorism. Fortunately, all of the board members have top secret security clearances, which is necessary to conduct a lot of our work since the programs and activities that we typically work on are highly classified.
And that's probably a good segue into FISA Section 702. Is it fair to say that there are classified aspects of the government's application and use of FISA Section 702?
Yes, definitely. Section 702 is a highly classified program. Only a select amount of information about the program has been officially declassified, which, unfortunately will limit the information that I'm able to share in this setting. So my comments today are really driven by what's already been declassified about Section 702. And, when we review a program like Section 702, we engage in both classified and unclassified aspects of the program. We evaluate it, and then we provide recommendations addressing potential concerns that the board may have identified. As you may know, Section 702 was initially a program that was authorized and approved by the president after September 11th, which means it was operating pursuant to the president's authority. But in 2008, Congress statutorily authorized the 702 program, and it is now officially recognized as an amendment to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, codified in Title VII of FISA and found in Section 702.
Can you give our listeners a general understanding of the purpose of Section 702 and what it authorizes the government to do? Who can the government target? What can it collect?
Section 702, as I mentioned, is codified as part of FISA, and it authorizes the executive branch to target the collection of communications of foreigners reasonably believed to be located outside of the United States in order to obtain foreign intelligence information. Importantly, Section 702 can't be used to target U.S. persons reasonably believed to be in the United States. That surveillance generally occurs in Title I or Title III of FISA. Section 702 is different than traditional FISA collection because of the scale of surveillance under Section 702, among other differences. In 2014, the PCLOB did a very public report assessing the Section 702 program as it operated at that time. The report discussed two types of surveillance in particular. One type was upstream surveillance, which sees the United States collect internet traffic through the internet backbone. The other kind of surveillance discussed in the 2014 report was downstream surveillance, then known as PRISM, which, and I'm quoting, which permitted the government to send selectors, such as an email address, to a U.S.-based electronic communications service provider, such as an internet service provider, that has been served a directive. The directive compels the provider to give the communication sent to or from the selector to the government. As will not surprise any of your listeners, the providers who receive a directive aren't allowed to discuss the directive. It's also important to note that no court approves the issuance of a particular directive under Section 702, and therefore no court approves the specific targeting of any particular individual in connection with the operation of the 702 program. While providers, electronic communication service providers, can challenge the directive before the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, those proceedings are rare and they are highly classified.
Now, you mentioned that under FISA Section 702, the government is only allowed to target non-U.S. persons. But sometimes the communications of U.S. persons are collected in the course of the surveillance directed at non-U.S. persons. Can you explain how that happens?
I think I can, Stephanie, at least to the extent possible. So there is a term called incidental collection, which in the context of Section 702 is used to refer to situations in which U.S. persons or people located in the United States have their communications acquired because they were in contact with a targeted foreigner who's located overseas. To the extent that a Section 702 target is in any communication with someone who is in the United States or otherwise a U.S. person, those communications are lawfully collected pursuant to the program as well. This allows the U.S. government to obtain U.S. communications without a warrant. Now, true, we, when architecting the program in the United States, could have architected this program a different way. That is, it could have been architected to only collect foreign-to-foreign communications. Instead, we've allowed the collection of domestic communications where at least one person is a foreigner. And as a result, the program is collecting U.S. persons in contact with a targeted foreigner. In my view, we are essentially treating international communications by U.S. persons as waiving any privacy interest in those communications. That really highlights the constitutional and legal challenges that the program has faced. We know that if the government wanted to target the U.S. person, there's no question that it would need a warrant to obtain access to U.S. person communications, unless it falls within a warrant exception. For many, the scanning and collection of their communications is a constitutional moment. That is, when you're using it, to scan and collect the communications of U.S. persons. However, in the operation of Section 702, that moment does not take place, or at least is not recognized as being constitutional for a variety of reasons.
So with respect to the collection or incidental collection of U.S. person information under FISA Section 702, I want to talk to you a bit about what is publicly known. For example, do we know the number of U.S. persons whose information is incidentally collected every year?
No, we do not know the number of U.S. persons whose information is incidentally collected every year, but we need to know that. In the 2014 PCLOB report reviewing the Section 702 program that I mentioned earlier, the board recommended that the National Security Agency attempt to calculate or otherwise obtain this number. I've been a strong advocate for calculating or estimating incidental collection along with the tagging of U.S. person data when an NSA analyst identifies such data in the course of an investigation. During the 2018 reauthorization, there was a lot of pressure to calculate the number of U.S. persons whose information was incidentally collected every year. Then the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coats, told Congress that to do so would be infeasible because the intelligence community and the NSA in particular, couldn't calculate an exact, accurate, meaningful, and responsible number as part of this. I've yet to see the infeasibility of how to calculate the number and have been recently reviewing a paper that Jonathan Mayer's research group at Princeton University has put out proposing a solution on how to estimate the incidental collection in connection with the 702 program. Professor Mayer's research proposes a novel approach to estimating incidental collection using secure multi-party computation, or MPC. The intelligence community possesses records about the parties to intercepted communications, and communication services possess country-level location for users. By combining these data sets with MPC, Professor Mayer believes it is possible to generate an automated, aggregated estimate of incidental collection that maintains confidentiality for intercepted communications and user locations. This seems pretty novel to me. I've yet to hear any concerns with Professor Mayer's approach. And it does seem as if it would meet the standard of at least feasibility that we were thinking about back in 2017, 2018. As mentioned earlier, though, I also believe we need to, in addition to counting or estimating the incidental collection, when an analyst becomes aware that a particular communication involves a U.S. person, it seems reasonable to implement a flag or a tag that would allow that analyst to easily note that they reasonably believe this to be a U.S. person, so that this information can be known to others who may come across the record in the future, and or can also trigger retention or deletion requirements, as well as facilitating transparency around the actual number of U.S. person communications that are reviewed by a human being. For the entire time that I've been a member of this board, I've advocated for more transparency around counting and tagging, not only in statutory programs like Section 702, but also in the EO 12333 context as well.
So if we don't currently know the number of U.S. persons whose information is incidentally collected every year under Section 702, do we know about all of the kinds or types of cases or investigations that the FBI may query databases containing U.S. person information collected incidentally under FISA Section 702?
Very good question, Stephanie. So the collection and searching, or querying is sort of the term of art that we use in the Section 702 context, is governed by the targeting, minimization, and querying procedures of each relevant intelligence community agency. Every year, those procedures have to be approved by the Attorney General, the Director of National Intelligence, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. The targeting procedures cover how the government will target foreigners. The minimization procedures cover the use, retention, and dissemination of Section 702 information. And the querying procedures cover the searching of collected Section 702 information. Most importantly, querying is really, again, another word for searching. The FBI can search 702 collections when it reasonably believes a search will be likely to return foreign intelligence information or evidence of a crime, which is to say, not only whether it's relevant to the target of the collection or whether it's relevant to national security, but the FBI also has the ability to search for evidence of any crime. Presumably anything under Title 18 would be fair game. And by looking at some of the compliance incidents that the Bureau has had over the last several years, we can tell some of the other ways in which Section 702 collections have been queried by the Bureau in violation of their procedures. We do know that significant compliance incidents occur from public FISA court documents and government public compliance incident reports. And there have been several iterations of the kinds of compliance incidents that have happened in the past where individuals at the Bureau have queried Section 702 collections for, looking for derogatory vetting, or, vetting pastors and members of the FBI Citizens Academy, which is meant to foster better community relations with the Bureau, running those names through Section 02 collections, running office repairmen through Section 702 collections, individuals who provide tips or are victims of a crime, running local political party through, or even a member of Congress through. Clearly, the use of Section 702 to at least query has been much more expansive than approved, and goes, and has gone in the past beyond even Title 18 evidence of a crime and foreign intelligence information.
So as you've just noted, this sounds like rather expansive searching through 702 databases. Do we know how often the FBI queries 702 databases for U.S. person information?
We do have a sense of how often the Bureau has been querying Section 702 collections, at least over the past 2 to 3 years. In 2021, the FBI conducted 3.4 million searches of Americans' electronic data, including approximately 1.9 million related to a cyber threat from Russia. And we also know that in 2020, it queried Section 702 collections for U.S. person information approximately 1.3 million times. In recent testimony, FBI Director Chris Wray noted that the 2021 number of U.S. person queries, 3.4 million, has dropped around 60%. Now, I'm just kind of doing this in my head here, but if you do the math on a 60% drop, that's approximately 200 some odd thousand queries that would have been done in 2022. Now, that would have been, to review those numbers, 1.3 million in 2020, 3.4 million in 2021, and 60% less in 2022, approximately 200,000 or so. If you add them all up, it's around 5 million queries of U.S. person information over the course of 3 years. We do have to then wonder about the value of each of these queries, bearing in mind that of all 702 collections that the U.S. government collected in a 1 month period, I believe in last year, 4.4% of that collection made its way to the Bureau. So 90+% never makes its way to the Bureau, and therefore the Bureau is not searching it as a part of U.S. person queries. But so we're looking at 4.4%, which is compounded every single month or every single year, so that when the Bureau is actually conducting a query, it's not just querying the data that was collected in 2021. It's querying the data collected in 2021 and 2020 and 2019 and 2018. So it all compounds itself to run these 5 million searches that we've been talking about. From the outset of sort of looking at this program, I've really been trying to understand how valuable these 5 million searches have been. And even if you look at the reforms that the Bureau has appropriately taken in the last year and a half or so, those numbers, even though they're substantially reduced, again, that 60% number, if you bring it down, even if it's at 200,000-ish or so, that 60%, you're looking at 550 queries, per day of U.S. person information in the database. And, those numbers are still remarkably much higher than other components of the intelligence community, NSA, or the National Counterterrorism Center, NCTC, or even CIA, who combined, when they report their transparency numbers, run U.S. person queries of about 9,000 versus 200,000, 3.4 million, 1.3 million. So I think we really have to ask ourselves, what's the value of U.S. person queries, and how many have resulted in preventing terrorist attacks in the United States? How many have resulted in criminal convictions in the United States? How many of these queries have made us safer? I am really interested in understanding that when we look at the value of the program, when we look at the value of U.S. person queries, we have to focus on not so much what the value of the targeting is and its efforts to ensure that we are appropriately mitigating foreign risks, but also to just understand why, in the context of domestic only situations or even domestic situations, it's as important to query these particular collections as much as we are doing or have been doing over the last several years.
So you touched a bit on this before, but I'd like to put a finer point on it. If the FBI was investigating a case and wanted to access the kinds of information collected under FISA Section 702, it would normally have to get a warrant, either a warrant under Title I of FISA or a warrant under the Wiretap Act. So the FBI is getting access to information that would normally require a warrant. which, when getting a warrant, requires a probable cause finding made by a federal judge to collect. It is my understanding that that is why some call these queries, quote, backdoor searches. Assuming all of that is correct, how does the kind of collection that Section 702 authorizes differ from what is often referred to as traditional FISA collection under Title I of FISA?
Under Title I, if the government wants to target a U.S. person, they are required to get a court order of probable cause that the target is an agent of a foreign power or engaged in foreign or counterintelligence activities. Section 702 is different than Title I surveillance because the court which oversees the surveillance, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, approves procedures that I mentioned earlier. It doesn't actually approve a particular targeting or even a warrant, unlike in traditional surveillance law, whether domestically or under Title I of FISA. The procedures that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court reviews allows the government to search for information, search or query for information of targets who may have had no connection to national security, who were not the targets of the actual directives that may have been issued pursuant to Section 702, but who's communicated with a target and therefore may have had their collections intercepted or otherwise obtained. Under Section 02, then, there's no warrant requirement. There's no probable cause requirement. It is not when querying, it's not a particularized determination, and the government can search the collected communications for any purpose, no matter what that is, as long as it can lead to evidence of a crime or foreign intelligence information. In the FBI's case, the procedures permit the Bureau to query its collections whenever they believe that a query is reasonably likely to return foreign intelligence information or reasonably likely to return evidence of a crime.
Now, turning to the topic of congressional reauthorization of FISA Section 702, as you've noted, Section 702 is expiring at the end of the year, and the government is seeking its reauthorization. And Travis, you've been very vocal about your concerns with a clean authorization of FISA Section 702, where no reforms are made. But before we get to those concerns, I want to talk about where you agree with the government. Over the past several weeks, the government has been talking about the critical tool Section 702 is for our national security. At a recent event at the Brookings Institution, Matt Olson, the Assistant Attorney General for the National Security Division, said that if Section 702 expires, the government would lose, quote, indispensable intelligence. Are there aspects of the government's position on Section 702 reauthorization that you do agree with?
Yes, I believe that the Section 702 program has significant and immense value, that lives have been saved as a result of this program, and that the country is safer with Section 702 than without it. It also allows us to keep up with evolving national security threats, such as cyber attacks on the homeland. I also believe that there's generally a culture of compliance within the intelligence community, and that in particular, the presence of civil liberties and privacy officers in each IC component can be credited for a lot of successes in the privacy and civil liberties compliance of the IC, and that those officers are truly critical to ensuring that the agencies continue to consider, respect privacy and civil liberties in their surveillance activities. I also agree that the intelligence community's compliance with efforts to protect privacy and civil liberties has continually gotten better throughout the operation of the program and throughout the oversight that the program has received over the last decade or so by the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board, by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, by Congress, by the inspectors general, as well as by the internal components within each of the intelligence agencies. I particularly would want to highlight the efforts that FBI Director Wray made in 2021 to improve the privacy and civil liberties protections associated with U.S. person querying. And finally, I also agree with Assistant Attorney General Matt Olson that the compliance issues that the program has had in the past involving U.S. person information are, in his words, and I'm quoting, especially damaging to the public trust. And it is for that reason that I believe that a clean reauthorization here is not the ideal scenario, but that, common sense changes and reforms to the program would ultimately help ensure and promote public trust.
So you've touched on some of them, but I want to give you the opportunity before we talk about what reforms you'd like to see Congress make to Section 702. I'd like to give you the opportunity to talk in greater detail about some of your concerns with the way the government searches or uses U.S. person information collected incidentally under Section 702.
As I mentioned before, and what I should expand upon here, is that I do have concerns about a clean reauthorization without significant common sense reforms to address privacy and civil liberties concerns. These concerns are related to incidental collection of U.S. persons, sharing of information within the intelligence community and outside of it, as well as court oversight. We can get into a very deep academic discussion on the issue of incidental collection. But there are 3 or 4 points that in my view, distinctions, 3 or 4 distinctions that warrant a more sophisticated scrutiny of the laissez-faire searching of all lawfully collected information. First, and I mentioned previously the concern about waiving the rights of U.S. persons, privacy rights of U.S. persons with respect to communications with foreigners. Section 702 is a program designed to operate essentially extraterritorially or extra constitutionally outside of the Fourth Amendment by targeting individuals who are reasonably believed to be located outside the United States. Now that's, that view of it being extra constitutional, the Fourth Amendment not really applying, really goes back to a long line of Supreme Court cases suggesting in particular that either there's no constitutional right outside of the Fourth Amendment right outside of the United States, or at the border, even Americans have lesser privacy interest in certain situations. That's old case law. Clearly, it didn't consider big data. It doesn't consider technological advancements, and there's new case law around privacy that has come to fruition. But I do think it's worth noting the new case law that we have and sort of rethinking whether the old diatribe that we've relied upon is necessarily as strong today as it may have been 30 years ago. Second, the government often argues that it should be able to query lawfully collected information for one reason, even though it's using it for a different reason, because it's more efficient. Efficiency and legality are cousins, but they're not siblings. I note that conduct may be not covered under the Constitution when done one way, but when done in a different context, it may be covered by the Constitution. And the mere fact that it's efficient doesn't necessarily mean that there is any constitutional moment that takes place. Which leads me to my third point. On the other hand, while efficiency and legality are cousins, efficiency and efficacy are siblings. Think about it. 5 million queries over a short period of U.S. personal information. What do we have to show for it? Yes, we know it was efficient. We know the search was efficient. They did it. They were able to query 5 million times. In one instance, 3.4 million times in a very short period. But were they effective? Where are the criminal prosecutions associated with those 5 million queries? Where are the Section F2 orders requiring the FBI to get a warrant in a predicated criminal investigation? Do you know, you could look at their reports, transparency reports that have been published. And if you look in 2018 at the number of F2 orders, again, an order for a warrant that the FBI is supposed to get anytime it conducts a predicated criminal investigation. In 2018, that number was 0. In 2019, that number was 0. In 2020, that number was 0. In 2021, that number was 0. So we are querying over 5 million, or approximately 5 million U.S. person terms in a 3-year period where we haven't gone at all during that time to the court to obtain a warrant for any of those. It's not aware, at least that I'm aware of criminal prosecutions. And if there, and we also are not at the same time seeing or hearing about a lot of other uses of this that have otherwise made us safer or better protected us. My view is that, there is, and I have a concern that we're sort of having a post hoc realization for what is much more accurately described as a fishing expedition. Lastly, I'd note that collection, querying, and dissemination are different. It's one thing to collect. It's another to decide who gets to read it. And, when there has to be masking and when there doesn't. Even the FBI distinguishes between collection and querying and dissemination. Why should we assume that there is not a legal distinction as well for each of those activities?
So based on all of those concerns, what reforms do you think that Congress should make to FISA Section 702?
Incidental collection is a significant issue to tackle. As we discussed earlier, we don't know how many U.S. communications are collected pursuant to Section 702, despite the fact that since 2014, the PCLOB has recommended the NSA develop a methodology and release the number of U.S. person communications collected under the program. However, that hasn't been done. We also know there's a massive number of queries. As I mentioned, over the last 3 years, it, approximately is 5 million. That's 5 million times that someone or someone ran searches of 702 collections, which are foreign communications, to look for information about people who are presumed to be U.S. persons. And what are they looking for? I think it's really important that we understand whether there are examples of value from those queries. Because as of now, we seem to have in the public domain minimal to negligible examples of value. We also have a lot of compliance issues, as AAG Olson referred to in his prior comments, and as I've also highlighted some during our conversation today. This is the story of how U.S. persons are being swept into the operation of the 702 program. And I believe there are several modifications to be made to help address these issues. Initially, abouts collection should be codified and extended to all surveillance. In the context of abouts collection, we're referring to communications that are collected not involving the target directly, but in which a target is discussed, for example. This is a significant issue to tackle, and in October 2018 FISA court ruling, we know that Amici and the government disagree about whether statutory abouts limitation has any application to downstream collection. In 2018, Congress required, as part of the reauthorization there, that even though the NSA had stopped or ceased doing abouts collection, that it would provide notice to Congress and the court before reinstituting that. I think we need to clearly codify the prohibition on abouts collection and not just make it a notice provision, and also make clear that it applies to both upstream and downstream communications. We also have to solve these things called batch job queries, which is when at the Bureau in particular, they are able to run a large number of queries using one justification. In 2021, Director Wray, as part of the reforms, capped the number of queries without approval of an FBI attorney at 100. However, you can get approval and you can run much larger numbers. We know that over the years, batch queries has been a source of some of the largest number of compliance incidents at the Bureau. Batch queries themselves are best seen as bulk searches, and we should consider bringing an end to batch queries themselves. Additionally, the issue of bulk searches reminds me of the president's recently released executive order 14806, which is one of the larger recent changes to signals intelligence made and is also part of the EU-US data protection framework. It's great to see this executive order, and I certainly applaud the president for signing it. It has brought important reforms to improve the privacy and civil liberties, not only of people in the United States, but also outside of the United States. One of the principles in the executive order is that surveillance needs to be necessary and proportionate. I have concerns about how batch queries can be made necessary and proportionate in principle. And I also believe that given that the executive order has been out since October 2022, it's critical that we ensure that the intelligence community conduct an analysis that Section 702 operates consistently with the executive order. Requiring the intelligence community to conduct an analysis now of how Section 702 operates consistent with the executive order, I believe, will be especially important because I do, as I mentioned earlier, share concerns about whether bulk or batch queries could meet this standard. And lastly, although most importantly, is given the compliance incidents that have taken place around U.S. person queries, given the relative lack of value that there appears to be for U.S. person queries, given that Section F2 orders are not taking place, I believe it is time for Congress to require the government to obtain prior court authorization before permitting U.S. person queries of Section 702 collections.
So I understand that the PCLOB is working on a report about FISA Section 702. When might the public be able to read that report?
We have hundreds of pages written, and we are hoping for a late summer or early fall release to the public. However, this is not entirely predictable because we're talking about a highly classified program where a substantial amount of declassification would need to take place, and that often takes a long time. For example, the board reviewed an NSA program called X-Keyscore as part of our review of surveillance tools under Executive Order 12333. which was a Reagan-era executive order about, among other things, signal intelligence. The board produced a detailed, classified report explaining NSA's use of X-keyscore as an analytic tool and relevant privacy and civil liberties protections in late 2020. 6 months later or so, I was able to release my unclassified statement regarding my concerns with X-keyscore. And it has been now more than a year and a half later since that statement was released, more than 2 years since the report really was finalized. And we're still waiting for the Department of Justice and the NSA to clear our report for public release. That's a long time. We can't take that long with Section 702. And I genuinely believe that the intelligence community, all the way up to the very tops of the community, are working with us to help us get the report out as quickly as we can and as transparently as we can while protecting national security interests as well.
Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners that maybe we didn't touch upon?
We've mostly discussed Section 702 in the context of the 2023 reauthorization and the consequences of this program for the privacy and civil liberties of U.S. persons. It's also worth noting that Section 702 has garnered international attention as well, particularly in Europe, where the program has been scrutinized by the Court of Justice of the European Union in connection with reviews of adequacy for transatlantic cross-border data transfer frameworks such as Privacy Shield and the new EU-US data privacy framework. These frameworks are responsible for more than $7.1 trillion in EU-US economic relationship. Whatever reforms, if any, Congress and the IC adopt will undoubtedly impact the adequacy determination for the new DPS. So it's important to understand that there's a significant economic component to the reauthorization as well. Other than mentioning the impact of Section 702 on the data privacy framework, I wanted to make sure to thank you, Stephanie, for your invitation to participate in this podcast today and for your insightful questions. I very much appreciated the engagement and the opportunity. And although they are not all here with me today, I also wanted to thank the staff of the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board and my fellow board members who are right now all working tirelessly to complete our review of the Section 702 program.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Travis, and we will look forward to seeing the PCLOB's Section 702 report when it comes out.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter at patreon.com/lawfare. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for our other podcasts, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfareblog.com. The podcast is edited by Jen Patja Howell, and your audio engineer this episode was Noam Osband of Goat Rodeo. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thank you for listening.